Ladies and gentlemen, you know a chess player is really special whenever they make even a single wrong move, the entire world shakes. Twitter rumbles at its core. People start chiming in about how this player is washed up and they will never be great again. And I'm talking, obviously, about Magnus Carlsen. Magnus Carlsen, undisputed best player in the world at the moment and very mildly disputed greatest player of all time. Obviously, people would argue Kasparov. He is currently playing in Norway chess, this interesting event where they combine classical chess with Armageddon, and his opponent for this game and this video is none other than Russian Grandmaster Sergei Karjakin, who played him in the World Championship match in 2016. Now, this video is a how-to guide on how you should play against Magnus Carlsen should you get a classical game against him. We're going to look at this game. It's a fascinating game, very interesting game, and hopefully you can have some takeaways for when you clash with Magnus in the future. Sergei is playing with the white pieces. He begins the game with e4, and when you play e4 against Magnus, it's a very high chance you get a Sicilian defense. Knight to f3. Now, Magnus's pet line in the Sicilian is the move knight c6. He played this exclusively in the World Championship match of 2018 against Fabiano Caruana, and he likes to go into the open lines of the Sicilian with d4, but also bishop b5 to Rossolimo. And after knight c6 was played exclusively at that match, knight c6 like took over. I mean, you got like 10-year-old kids playing knight c6, trying to model their repertoires after Magnus Carlsen. Thousands and thousands of games have paved the way of theory, but Karjakin plays into d4. He does not go for the Rossolimo. Takes, and if you play this against Magnus, it's a very high chance you're going to get this move, e5, which is known as the Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian defense. Rest in peace to the legend, Yevgeny Sveshnikov, passed away recently. And knight b5. d6. There are two ways to handle this position with white. Number one is to play bishop to g5 to try to target this knight and fight for the center square d5. I mean, that's obviously the whole concession of black's position, is that the d5 square is slightly weak, and this pawn can be slightly weak, but black will respond with a queenside strike. The second way, and actually the much more modern way, is to throw this knight into the middle of the board right away. Fabiano did this against Magnus, and since then, Magnus has played it with white and with black. So step one, it seems, of beating Magnus, just go directly into the prep that he probably knows better than how to spell his own name. So we have knight d5, and obviously you have to take. You cannot take this pawn because the knights are about to jump into c7. Take, pawn takes. And now there's two moves. Believe it or not, this move is not the most common, which kind of is surprising. Actually, the most common move is to undevelop your knight completely. And Magnus has played this himself on both sides. And the idea is that, well, your knight is like, it's safe now, and it can always jump out to d7 and maybe to c5. You kind of won the battle of the center because now you can always play f5. So you're always going to have more pawns in the center than your opponent. And what exactly is this knight doing? Actually, oftentimes white will even play c4 to then bring this knight back to e3, for example, or to or behind the pawn, to stand behind the pawn. So at least you have more control in the center with pawns. But in this game, Magnus plays knight e7, which is played about 1/3 of the time. It's played in 2,000 games, according to my database. Knight b8 has been played 6,000 times. And now, of course, Karjakin plays c4, and Magnus rotates the knight over to g6. Believe it or not, Magnus and Karjakin have actually, I believe, played an exact game like this in the past. And also Magnus, like I said, has had this position with white. He's also had this position with black. So, I mean, how more well-prepared can you be? So queen a4 here is a threat on the king through the knight. So the bishop comes here, and now the queen isn't guarding the pawn anymore, so the move queen b4. All of this has been played in the past. Here, Magnus has tried the move bishop to f5 before, just defending this pawn, right? But also there's this move queen b8. So the most common move in this position is just to play queen b8. Black temporarily negates all threats and is ready to just kick out this knight. Okay, great. Here, white has a couple ways to develop. He chooses the move h4. This is actually, believe it or not, it is a bit of a developing move because this knight is on an awkward square. So just to show you how bad it can get, if you play h5, this is just already completely winning for white. Because this knight has nowhere to go. If it goes to e7, you lose d6. And if it goes to f4, you can just trap it with g3. So black actually has to respond to h4, most likely with at least h5, or equal danger on the other side. And yet, Magnus has also had this position himself in the past. Bishop e3. Now, Magnus Carlsen has played this position two ways before. Number one, he played a6 to attack the knight and kick it out. And then here he has played a5 to attack the queen, and f5, and f5 to try to create some sort of attack over here. He played a5 in the tiebreaker rapid game against Fabiano Caruana in the World Championship match. He won that game. And he's played f5 against Jordan van Forest in Tara Steel Classical Chess 2019, I believe. In this game, he plays bishop to e7. So, Karjakin is just in Magnus's territory, like all of it. There's landmines everywhere, but he knows the prep well enough himself. He clearly has done his homework. And White plays the move g3 to guard this, and now castles. And this is fascinating, because Magnus has put his pawn on h5, and he's basically left it to die. He's just completely left the pawn to die. I mean, you're not saving this pawn. If you play bishop g4, we have the same problem as last time. I get to play h5. And let me tell you something. If you ever have to play knight to h8 in a game and keep a straight face, yeah, chances are you're probably going to lose. All right, this is not chess 960. So Magnus plays bishop e2. Karjakin plays bishop e2, and Magnus just gives him the h5 pawn. He just gives him the h5 pawn while creating a queenside initiative. So Karjakin takes on b5 to kind of freeze the structure and takes on h5. Okay, he's calling the bluff. He's like, Magnus, I get it, you're the world champion. I get it that you beat me in a match. I get it. But what the hell, bro? You're down a pawn. Pawn's a pawn, even in Norway. And here Magnus plays the move bishop to d8. This is a very high-level move. The idea of this move is that he's rerouting the bishop to potentially the queenside to either trade on with this bishop, which is very strong, or go to a5 and laser beam the diagonal. He has another idea. The knight now can go to e7 in many cases, pressuring the center. Also f5, right, to target the same bishop. And this bishop has no target. Now, taking like this and doubling the structure is an idea, but I don't know why you would just voluntarily give Magnus the open file, castles, and just have a ton of light squared weaknesses. But it actually is a way to play. You could theoretically take on g6. It's not a very pretty move, so Karjakin just decides to play short castle, and Magnus brings the knight back again. His position is like a slingshot. He's corking it back all the way with his pieces, right? The pieces are all the way back, but they're about to just roll forward very quickly. Karjakin plays bishop g5. The idea of this move is probably that you are going to trade this bishop at some moment. I mean, I would imagine. And if you get booted, I guess his idea was he was going to come back. I doubt to the same square, but maybe. Because f6 is just screaming to be played, right? And then the question is, what now? So Magnus thinks for a while. He decides to continue with this plan to bring the bishop to the queen side to attack. Karjakin drops back with the queen, and here comes the knight. So now here come the pieces. Back to take 2 steps forward. Bishop a5, knight f5. Karjakin plays knight back to e2. And Magnus also goes back to b6. And just in a few moves, it becomes very clear that one gentleman has won the diagonal battle. He's also pressuring the pawns. I don't know what these bishops are doing. It's adorable that they're holding hands together, but they're not actually attacking anything. There is like a vague hope that you might fork something here. I don't know. And so he plays rook c1, and all of a sudden, after rook c1, Magnus realizes now is the best moment to pay homage to young Elo. And he plays rook to a4, and now we see the problem. The past few moves for Karjakin have not been very coordinated, right? He didn't want to trade the knight for the bishop, so he ventured the bishop out here with just a vague threat of going to e7. This bishop has won a pawn and has not returned home. He's about to become a AWOL. And this rook on a4 is just hitting the whole thing. And you don't know where it's going. It could go to c4, d4, e4, probably not here, but like here, somewhere there in the future. So now Karjakin plays rook to c6. And this is step 2 of how to beat Magnus Carlsen. Confuse the hell out of him. All right, he's got a better position even at the cost of a pawn. You play directly into his prep. He is better prepared on the plans of the positions. Do you know how many training games Magnus Carlsen has probably played in these structures? I don't know. You'd probably have to ask him. He's probably trained against the engine. He's played against humans. When these top guys prep the style of position that they play, they know so much that doesn't even get played over the board. At least I'm assuming. I don't know. Maybe they're all like, Levy, you have no idea what you're talking about. We never prep. We just eat Cheetos and drink Snapple. There's nothing. We don't do anything else. I'm assuming that they know what's going on. So he knows how to play this position, and Karjakin slaps the rook down to c6. Now, if you're watching this and you're confused, now, if you're watching this on the video, you see that the bishop can take the rook. If you're watching this in another tab while coding or doing homework or, other things that you do on the internet, look, you got to come back. Look, the rook is hanging. Karjakin just straight up gives him a rook. The Trojan rook, if you will. Now, if you take this rook, okay, the pawn opens up, the queen opens up, and white's position kind of looks nice, even at the cost of that piece. If you don't take, if you just leave the rook there, like, I don't really understand. You're not actually threatening anything. You're not even threatening to take on b5 because bishop takes f2 check, and I win your queen. Like, if Magnus just plays queen a7, he continues the pressure on the queen side. He continues to pressure the diagonal. He can also lock this rook in and then win it in an advantageous way, or trade it off. It's another idea, just trade it. Don't even let it, like, don't give Karjakin any satisfaction. But Magnus is so shocked by the move rook c6. He's like, what is this guy doing? That's just a rook. Like, I'm a principled guy. Now I have a rook and a pawn. Oh, sorry. I have a rook for a bishop and a pawn. So I have a 1 point advantage. But he lost the rook, bro. Like, what? He's got no threats either. He can't even attack anything. f7's guarded. This is guarded. So Magnus here plays rook c4, just immediately looking to win this pawn back. Again, you cannot take on b5 because bishop takes f2, and you lose your queen. So Karjakin here detonates a4, which is a wild move, because when you move your rook off a square that's covered twice, the last thing you expect is to get hit with a4. And here's the idea of this move. So if you take with the pawn, you lose your rook. Simple. If you take with the rook, then you wouldn't believe it. You still can't take on b5, but there is this move, bishop g6. And if you attack f5, the queen can't protect it because then b5 is hanging. And if you go to the middle, then after it takes, the bishops get in. Like, I'm hitting this, you can't move because queen f7. This is actually kind of problematic. So a4 is a very tricky move. Very tricky. And you can also take on c6. You can take the pawn, which is the culprit of the whole position. But then your pieces, look how poorly they coordinate. You can't play knight e7 or knight d4. The knight gets taken. If you defend both pieces with the queen, you got to get to this position. And I'm not really sure who's even better here, because I'm a couple moves away from just straight up mating you. Okay, bishop f6, queen h5, and queen h8 is a mate. And if you come back to trade my bishop, like, I don't have to trade. I can hang out. And also I can just play rook d1, knight d5. All your pawns look really soft and really tasty. So, very problematic situation for Magnus after a4. He should not have called the bluff. Sergei is now back in business. Knight d4, we have a trade of knights and take on b5. This is the way Magnus decides to go about it. He wants Karjakin to kind of blockade his own pawns. And he plays the move d5. Now, d5 is a move. He can also play rook c5 here to try to attack the pawns, because obviously the pawns can't move. They need to defend each other. And if Karjakin were to defend passively here, then a rook takes c6 is an oopsie. Rook c6 is an oopsie only in this case, because if you try to do it here, then bishop to e7 is again a problem. The rook needs to stay guarding f7. And if it can, it's just going to be lost. Then there goes all of your advantage. Too many threats. So Magnus plays d5. Now the queen's diagonal is blocked. But Karjakin trades rooks. When he's losing, I mean, he's not down material anymore. He's gotten his pawns back. But he trades rooks. Because now d5 is under pressure. And the pawns are going to walk up the board. But not yet. That's the thing. Not yet. Magnus blocks the pawns and starts creating counterplay on f2. So the truth is that once you play directly into Magnus's preparation and play a move so confusing, it rattles his world. The third step of beating Magnus is, you know, at all costs, this man will try to liquidate to an endgame. He's so good at winning endgames, but he's so good at defending them too. He creates practical chances even against the best players in the world. So bishop e3, cold-blooded decision by Karjakin to trade. And by the way, notice that he's not fiending for a queen trade. This, of course, is winning because these pawns are too far advanced. But Magnus wouldn't do that. He would just take on b5. And once you lose this pawn, it's a very high chance that you actually lose the game. So he takes with the f-pawn, voluntarily weakening his king's position. The pawns are very delicate, but it's not easy for Magnus to get in. Again, if you just go for belligerent counterplay, I'm going to, believe it or not, just take on d5. And this looks scary, I admit, but you're completely safe. There's a difference in chess between, oh my god, that looks scary, and oh my god, that is scary. because there's no checks. It's all about concrete danger. There's no checks. You're completely safe. Rook A1 looks scary, but it's not, because you're actually getting to this king much faster. King H8, and yes, you might have to find a move like bishop to F3, and you're safe. There is still no checks. So you're completely fine. So Magnus goes for rook D8. Now he has a new plan. Blockade these pawns and push the D pawn. Karjakin, king G2. Cool as a cucumber. Organic, non-GMO cucumber. King to G2. Magnus kicks out the bishop. Bishop back to E2 and king G7. This is always going to be useful. Because now obviously the queen doesn't have the same diagonal as the king. Queen C3. Okay, D4, playing directly into the plan, takes. Let me block this pawn real quick. All my queen side is safe. Now what? How am I going to win now? Queen A5, and now Magnus begins employing a bit of a slow crawl into the position. Queen B4. Apparently, it was better to employ rook E8 first as a move order before you played queen B4. I'll show you why. So queen B4, B3 was played in the game, but I believe that now you can play queen E4. This is the way the computer wants to handle this position. Just give B2, completely give this away, and then go here. Which is a little bit not very human. It's just not very human to give away a pawn for absolutely zero reason. And there's just no counterplay. I mean, you just very slowly push these pawns. Instead of that, Karjakin decided to create a very pretty defensive formation. It's a very aesthetic thing. Everything is guarded. The problem with doing it this way is that apparently here, even C7 is faster. C7 is apparently a very quick move and leads to a transformation into a winning endgame. So like this, and here the absolutely savage bishop takes F5. Hello, hello. Me have rook down, and you can check me, but I'm going to win your rook. And if you take, check, I pick this up, winning endgame. But you're not going to do that unless you're 2,000% sure that it's winning. So instead of that, he gets the very pretty formation. Magnus brings in the queen, and right here, Karjakin, for an inexplicable, completely, like, he of course, king H3 is what we've always been pointing out, but he has so many moves that win. He can play queen D5, for example, allowing this check, and then king H3, and the big difference is that there's just too many threats. Like queen E1, queen D4 is winning, so Karjakin voluntarily just goes to H3, and Magnus here could have played queen to E1, which could have potentially led to this position. And you actually can't take this. If you play bishop takes D3, first of all, I have check. But second of all, I have rook E3. So I'm forking you, and I have queen H1 on the way. And queen G3. So it's bad news. So we could have ended up in a position, and queen D3, queen H1. We could have ended up here, where there would have been 4 queens on the board, and God knows what is going on. And only God. And God's not Magnus in this case. Only God knows what's going on in this position. So Magnus goes back, doesn't go for the active counterplay, and decides that the way he's going to save this is by sacking the pawn, winning the bishop. And notice Karjakin actually goes for this too, because his pawns are too far advanced. A rook cannot protect 2 passed pawns together on the 6th rank. 2 squares away from promotion, it's not strong enough. It can't guard both. On the 5th rank, yes, it has time. It doesn't have time. But you know what Magnus goes for? In this position, Magnus is going for this endgame. He wants an endgame where he gets rook and 2 versus queen and 2. You know why? Because this endgame, right here, something like this might be a draw. Yeah, this is the way you draw rook versus queen. You create a fortress. Your rook stands and patrols an entire section of the board, protected by everything. And believe it or not, I am not sure there's a way to break through this, because if you walk up to this rook and try to sacrifice for it to transform the endgame into a winning endgame, then the rook will just go to h5. You're never actually going to win the rook. And if you get really close, it doesn't matter. You're never going to win the pawn. Never. And your king's never going to cross the middle either. So is Magnus a genius? Has he found the solution to this position? No. Because here Karjakin implements step 3 of defeating Magnus Carlsen. You got to be ready for the endgame conversion. And he plays the move h5. I cannot tell you how important it is to, even at the cost of a pawn, very temporarily in the endgame, to split the structure. Because that allows for so much. That allows for so much. First of all, it depends now, rook and pawn versus queen. The pawn has to be in a very specific setup. If the pawn is even one row over or one rank up or two ranks up, there is no fortress sometimes because there's enough space on the board. But the way that Karjakin does this, he marches this, gets his queen, and just brings it back. This position is completely winning for white. And here Magnus Carlsen resigned the game. Why? Why is it winning? Great question. Well, let's try to find a move. You see, what white wants is to check the king and win the rook. If white can, check the king and win the rook with a fork. Like, for example, rook d5, queen b7, or queen g2, GG. But if the rook hangs out on the 5th rank, like rook to a5, I'm going to just touch up this rook real quick because I want this pawn. So if I can win this pawn, I'm just easily winning. And if the rook, again, hangs out like on f5, well, then I'm gonna come closer. Now the rook is slowly running out of squares. You say, no, look at black's position. It's a fortress. You know what happens when the king and the rook are on the same line? I played this absolutely savage move. It's Zugzwang. You can't move a piece. You have to move the king, and I take your rook. Ouch. So that doesn't work. So what do? Let's say you keep hanging out. There is nowhere to hang out. Nowhere to hang out. Rook a5, rook b5, check, and you lose. King h6, great idea. Wonderful idea. Love it. Check. King g6. I don't know. I probably mate you somehow. Or again, Zugzwang. And if you go back to h6, I mean, we can get this position and I can play queen d3. Like, you're just going to run out of moves at some point. You have nothing. And the worst part is, about a position like this, there are going to be moments, let's just say you employ cocoon defense, like this. You're like, no, he can't get to me as long as I can sack the queen for the rook. Because this is a winning king and pawn endgame. So you are just totally out of resources. And it's only possible because he sacked the h-pawn to split black structure. You say, well, why did Magnus do that? He didn't have to take. It doesn't matter. It didn't matter if he took or not. Like if Magnus played rook c6, first of all, h8 check, by the way. H6 check might also be winning. But like, what's he going to do? If he doesn't take, if he plays like here, well, I can take, but I can also just go here. That's mate. So that's bad. And this is probably also mate. That's also bad. So Sergei Karjakin wins a really nice game of chess, which was really made possible by that sacrifice on c6 on move 24. And what's funny is that if not for that, then Magnus actually had a pretty decent position, which now will mean that we have to go back to the drawing board against this variation. Magnus's pet line continues to hold serve, but Karjakin shows that the way to do it is to complicate the waters, muddy the waters, not complicate the waters, muddy the waters versus Magnus, create a very, very tense position, potentially at the cost of material, and don't show a degree of respect, and then you have to convert it all in the endgame. So a very nice win by Karjakin, wanted to share it all with you, and now you know the next time you play Magnus, the steps that you need to take in order to defeat him. Results may vary.